Welcome back to Grade 8 History, Unit Number 1, Creating Canada, 1850 to 1890. This is Lesson Number 12. How did women challenge the federal government? And how did the provinces resist federal control? Before we begin today's lesson, let's consider the following. Besides the Métis and the First Nations, what other groups of people do you think were challenging the federal government? I'll give you a hint. Uh, if you flip back to the title slide, you'll get at least a couple of ideas there. But right now, please put the video on pause so that you can consider and then write down your response to this question. And let's begin. The Métis and the First Nations were not the only people fighting to be heard by the federal government. In the 1800s, Canada was a patriarchal society, meaning that it was controlled by men. Only men were allowed to work outside the home, run businesses, and take part in politics. Society believed that a woman's responsibilities were raising children and tending to the home. And according to the Upper Canada Law Journal, when a woman married, she was expected to give up all of her civil rights. Some women did take on work outside the home, mainly to raise money needed to pay for basic needs. Many working class women worked as housekeepers, tutors, or seamstresses. If a woman was married, her husband controlled her wages. A woman could go to school but not to university, meaning that she could not become a doctor or a lawyer. A woman was not allowed to vote, also meaning that she could not run for political positions. Now, unmarried Canadian women could work as teachers. However, if a woman teacher got married, she would be expected to give up her job. One way women were able to participate in public life was by organizing charities. Many charities were sponsored by churches, which still served as the center of society's social and cultural activities. By the mid 1800s, more women were starting to set up organizations that would push for social changes that they felt were necessary. In the 1870s, the alcohol industry was growing steadily. It was very easy for businesses to get licenses to sell alcohol. Many women became concerned with the social issues caused by alcohol consumption, including family income being spent on alcohol and domestic violence. In response, a number of women formed the Women's Christian Temperance Union, or WCTU for short, in 1874. The WCTU's mission was to convince the government to ban the sale of alcohol or force prohibition. Just take a look at this painting here. My question is, how does this painting challenge society's belief that women belonged only in the home? Please put the video on pause so you can take a deeper look at this painting and then you can write down your response to this question. Okay, let's proceed. By the 1890s, the WCTU members realized that temperance campaigns were not enough to force prohibition. They knew that women needed the right to vote in order to elect a government that supported prohibition. The right for women to vote is also known as suffrage. In 1877, Dr. Emily Stowe formed the Toronto Women's Literary Club, or TWLC. Outsiders thought the TWLC was just a book club, but secretly it was Canada's first women's suffrage organization. In 1883, Stowe changed the club's name to the Canadian Women's Suffrage Association. Members actively campaigned for federal and provincial support for women's right to vote. They were often met with quote-unquote polite rejection, most often by Ontario's Premier Oliver Mowat. And we'll be talking a lot more about Ms. Stowe in our second unit. In 1884, Prime Minister MacDonald presented a bill that would give unmarried women the right to vote. Unfortunately, the bill was defeated in the House of Commons. MacDonald made a second attempt to introduce a bill to give women the right to vote in 1885, but he was again defeated. In the provinces, the women's suffrage movement had some success. In 1884, widows and older unmarried women who owned property gained the right to vote in Ontario. During the 1890s, other provinces followed Ontario's lead. However, only widows, unmarried women, and women who owned property could vote. MacDonald knew that many other members of Parliament were against women's right to vote. Why then do you think he tried to get women the right to vote? Interesting to consider. So I want you to put the video on pause so that you can consider this question and then write down your response. Okay, let's move on. During the 1880s, the federal government also found itself fighting with the provinces. Confederation had promised benefits for all of the provinces, but most provinces felt that the federal government had too much power. MacDonald made it no secret that he wanted the federal government to have full control over the provinces. Just take a look at this political cartoon here. It says all provincial business transacted at Ottawa. And you see these men here who are bowing down to John New MacDonald, who is wearing a crown. My question for you is, how does this political cartoon show us MacDonald's vision of the federal government controlling the provinces? Okay, there is a certain degree of sarcasm within this cartoon, but I want you to put the video on pause now so that you can take a closer look at the cartoon and then write down your response to the question in blue. And moving forward. During the 1880s, Oliver Mowat challenged MacDonald's vision of an all-powerful federal government. Mowat took the federal government to court over the federal government granting land acquired in a treaty with a native tribe in Ontario to the St. Catharines Milling and Lumber Company. Mowat argued that the federal government could not grant the land since the land in question was never really owned by the First Nations peoples who lived there. The Supreme Court of Canada agreed with the First Nations view of land ownership, meaning that all land aside from reserve land belonged to the provinces, not the federal government. And according to Siksika Chief Crowfoot, the land which the First Nations quote unquote gave away when signing the number of treaties actually belonged to the Great Spirit. So even though they signed these treaties, the First Nations people said, in the end, the land is everybody's, and there is a greater spirit who truly owns the land. Many industries in the Maritimes are struggling financially after Confederation. This led Nova Scotia's Premier, William S. Fielding, to introduce a motion in the legislature to create a maritime union. This meant that Nova Scotia and other maritime provinces would separate from Canada. In 1887, however, Nova Scotia voters helped MacDonald win the federal election, causing Fielding's dream to perish. Before Confederation, New Brunswick's Catholic schools were not part of an official separate school system, but they were supported by the government. In 1871, the provincial government reformed its education system, taking away financial support for Catholic and French schools. The federal government refused to get involved. In 1875, the Caracat riot broke out. What started out as a peaceful protest became a violent clash that resulted in the death of an Acadian man and a police officer. After the riot, French and Catholic education was allowed by the provincial government, but only after school. Just take a look at this illustration. How prepared were the protesters for violence. Please put the video on pause, take a closer look at this illustration, and then write down your response to the question I just asked. Okay, and moving ahead. These events in New Brunswick angered Quebec politician Honoré Mercier. He resented that Quebec voters had supported John A. Macdonald for over 20 years, only for Macdonald to seemingly ignore French Canadians' feelings. The execution of Louis Riel was the final straw for Mercier. He ran for election, and in 1886 he became the Premier of Quebec. Mercier then sought the creation of an all-French Canadian political party that could challenge Macdonald. Conflicts between the provinces and the federal government over education, language, and religious rights were also present in Western Canada. In 1870, the Manitoba Act allowed for a two-part public school system for the French and the English. However, since so many Métis departed after 1870, the population became mostly English Protestant. The English Protestant majority called for the provincial government to stop funding French Catholic schools, and the Manitoba government passed the Public Schools Act of 1890. When Manitoba's French Catholics appealed to the federal government to overturn this act, Macdonald refused to get involved, fearing his involvement would lead to more conflict between his government and Manitoba. Question for you, but you don't have to put the video on pause. Do you recognize the man in this photograph? We will be learning more about him in future lessons, including how he resolved the quote-unquote Manitoba schools question. But right now, let's finish today's lesson by considering the following. Number one, what things have changed since the 1890s about women's rights? What things have stayed the same? Question 2. What is the significance of the issues we learned about for Canada today? So when I finish speaking, you are going to put the video on pause so that you can consider your answers to these two questions and then, of course, write down your responses. If you don't feel confident in answering one or either of these questions, it means you need to go back, watch this video at least one more time, and then when you're ready, when you're confident, put the video on pause. And I look forward to a lively discussion based around everybody's responses to these as well as the other questions posted earlier in this recording. But until we meet again, this concludes today's video.